But I was paying 80% taxes. So, and I really didn't like that very much. When I say 80%, I'm looking at it from what the employer is paying to what I'm actually being able to spend in the store. Give you an example. In Germany, if the employer pays you $100, he has to pay 97 to the government first. You're getting 100, but they will withhold 48, which means you're only getting 52. If you go to the store to buy something, the sales tax is 19 to 20%. If you put your money in the bank, there's a 25% tax on any interest. They're not paying interest anyway. So make a long story short, I looked for alternatives. I did 2 trips around the world and looking at different places, and I found Singapore. There was a book I read which is called From First World to Third World. No, I'm sorry, From Third World to First World, which basically was written by the Prime Minister from 1965 to 89, who pretty much built Singapore in what it is today. And I was amazed because I saw a government which was truly built for the well-being of its people for the long term, and was very well organized. So I said, I'm going to move there, and taxes were low. Now, that was the first lesson I learned, which is jurisdiction. When I moved to Singapore, I still ended up working for the same company in Germany, but suddenly, also 197 I got straight into my pocket because I was no longer subject to German tax, and Singapore said, if you're earning it in Germany, we don't care, we don't tax you. So I quadrupled my salary doing the same thing I did before, but changing jurisdiction. So there is this lesson where we have 190 or so jurisdictions around the world. Some of these are better, some of these are worse, depending on what you want to do. Sometimes it's worthwhile to look at what benefits you can get by going to a certain jurisdiction. After moving to Singapore, I ended up working for Commerzbank, which is Germany's second biggest bank. And funnily enough, the first thing they did was send me right back to Germany. But they sent me back on a Singaporean contract. So I was an expat in my own country. I was still paying Singapore taxes, even though I was working in Germany now. And that was 2008. And second half 2008. And that was when Lehman Brothers ended up defaulting. And I was pretty much in the trading room when that happened. At the time, I was building compliance systems as senior data architect. And I basically saw the financial system coming to a standstill. When one banker no longer trusts the other banker, then the flow no longer happens. There was one German bank which sent $50 million to Lehman Brothers the day they went bankrupt. There was a big newspaper article saying the dumbest bank in Germany. And nobody wanted to be the next dumbest person. So basically, everything stopped. And that was a big lesson because our financial system is all based on trust. If that trust is going to be put into question, as happened in 2008, then a lot of other things go into question. And at that time, people ended up going and buying physical precious metals. And I was there scratching my head and decided, you know what, I might as well try and buy a little silver bar myself. Silver was keeping on falling. It was $9.50 at the time. And when I went to the bullion store, I couldn't get any. They would only buy bullion, they would not sell. There was a lesson where I realized that physical bullion and price exposure are 2 different things. When a crisis happens, you cannot find silver, and it's very hard to find gold. So that was a lesson. So eventually, bailouts ended up solving the whole problem. We printed a lot of money, and things kind of moved on. So the financial world didn't come to an end. But I moved back to Singapore, and I said, this is going to happen again, because the 2008 crisis was caused by too much debt, too much interdependence, too much leverage. And these things have gotten worse now. So for the next crisis, I want to own physical metal, and I want to own it in a jurisdiction which I deem to be safe. And that's basically what the start of silver bullion was back in 2009. Since then, we sold around $330 million worth of physical gold and silver. We're storing $180 million for our customers. And we've become one of the biggest players in the physical retail sort of site in Singapore. So I'll start off with the next crisis, what makes me concerned. And to start off, if we compare 2008 with 2016, a few weeks ago, the LBMA, which is the big event in the bullion industry, was held in Singapore. And William White, the chairman of the OECD Economic Development and Review Committee, basically said that global debt levels are 20% higher than they were in 2008. Because the world has a lot of debt. As you know, in the United States, the federal deficit has gone up 110% since 2008. We're getting close to $20 trillion now. And the monetary base is up 450%. We've been printing a lot of cash. And we had the head of macro strategy and FX for Standard Chartered at the same conference. He pointed out that 26% of global bonds now are negative yields. There's something wrong with this, because there's so much debt out there, and yet interest rates are very, very, very low. These are imbalances in the system, and they will have to be corrected at some point. Now, people often don't realize how much a trillion is. So what we do here is we take $100, we take 100 of these, makes 10,000. We take 100 of these, we get 1 million. We take 100 of these, and we create a pallet of $100 million. So if you look at this and we put it to scale, this is what the pallet will be. This will be a trillion in $100 bills. So the amount of debt increase that we had over the last 8 years, this is a little bit dated now, is always this. We basically doubled the amount of debt in 7 short years. And the amount of debt that is being created is increasing. The pace is increasing. So that raises concerns. Now, England raises debt a lot more in the percentage terms. They're at over 200% of what it was in 2008. Japan is on a normal ratios and so on, the one which is increasing debt at the biggest stage. They're also monetizing their debt at very, very fast rates. So this is not a good macro situation we're in. In the United States, we also have something called unfunded liabilities. It basically means that Social Security and Medicare are not fully funded. And as more baby boomers are going to retire, the government has to come up and fund these somehow. You'll see that most of these funds are actually running out, or have already run out for Medicare, and are going to be running out for Social Security, which means that the amount of debt increase is going to increase at a faster and faster rate. From a fiscal point of view, we're also looking at tax decreases, which, while good, are going to make the deficit probably worse and more expenditures. Now, looking at this from another point of view, which is what's called the monetary liquidity pyramid. In other words, what type of money do we have out here? Because there's base money, which is then multiplied through banks and so on and so on. But what I would want to focus here is this graphic. Now, what you see down here, that's the Statue of Liberty. And the amount of cash here represents $1 quadrillion, which is the amount of derivatives we have out there. And derivatives are basically bets between different banks, and it represents the interconnectivity of the banks. This is basically the too big to fail problem. If one of these banks fails, and they're large enough, it's going to be a follow-up event with other banks being in a similar situation. And that's what ended up causing the 2008 crisis. That's why bailouts had to be made. That's why these banks cannot be allowed to sell. And these amounts are huge. And they've not been getting any smaller. So we basically are in a situation where the system is not very stable, and there can be a catalyst. There can be something which can make the whole system become critical at some point, just like it happened in 2008. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. That was the catalyst for the crisis. What's the next catalyst? Well, we don't know. We don't know when it's going to happen, and we don't know what it's going to be. But I would like to give a personal example of what happened to the villas we sold back in 2005, 2006. Sorry, this one is wrong, it should be 2006. But we essentially sold a villa with 30 apartments, or so 24 in Italy. We sold it for 2.7 million euros. The banks lent around $2 million out of that. Now, sorry, this dates here wrong, but anyway, the buyer defaulted 2004, this will be 2006 as well, and the property ended up going back to the bank. The banks couldn't sell the property. It was actually a consortium of 3 different banks. One of them was Monte dei Paschi di Siena, which you might have heard. It's one of the oldest banks in the world and one of the biggest problem banks in Italy. By 2012, they finally decided they're going to do a public auction. The public auction was for 1.6 million euros. Nobody took it. By 2014, they did another public auction for 1 million. By 2015, they did it for 800,000. Nobody took it. 2016, just recently, my dad actually bought it back for €500,000. The point why I'm showing this, and the media is starting to talk about this, is that this didn't happen to one property, it happened to both properties. One property was bought by an Italian owner who ended up selling iron to the Chinese. When the iron price fell, he basically ended up losing everything, and that's what happened with this property. The other one went to a bunch of Irish investors who ended up defaulting. Again, it went back to the banks. The bank couldn't sell it. The banks are sitting on 1.5 million euros of losses and no interest for a long period of time. If that happened to both of our properties, just imagine how much of that happened in Italy. The reason why it went down so much is because if you rent a property in Italy and your tenant does not pay, it takes 3 to 4 years to kick them out. On top of that, the Italian government always needs revenue, and they're saying, well, let's tax these rich people which have a second or third home more and more money. So suddenly, you have a property which, instead of being an asset, people are starting to view it as a liability. Then banks have been losing money on these things. They don't really want to give new mortgages, so it becomes harder to actually finance a new real estate. These are the reasons why Italy real estate is going down so much. So Italian real estate is very cheap. I would advise against buying Italian real estate, though, because I believe Italy will leave the euro. I believe Italy will leave the euro because the fiscal situation is really, really atrocious. And in the past, they just printed money. It's easy to print money. You don't have to raise taxes as much. But they can do so while in the euro. So most likely will go back to the lira. If they go back to the lira, the value of this property is going to fall more. So that could be one of the catalysts. So to summarize the section, based on my experience and what I see, I believe you're going to have another crisis, which will be a lot bigger than what we had in 2008. There's still a lot of debt in the system. A lot of these loans are not marked to market. Some countries might be better off than others. But it is a huge problem. Leverage, debt, and interdependence between the facilities have been bigger than ever. And unlike 2008, interest rates are already close to zero or negative. We can't really push it much lower. So there's no more ammunition to get the economy going when we have the next recession. Furthermore, governments are unlikely to do another bailout. The political will is not there anymore to bail out banks, and this time it will be much bigger. So we have to prepare to the idea that we might have bail-ins. And the bail-in basically means that if you have money in a bank and that bank is going to fail, some of that money is going to be used to basically pay off debts that that bank has. It happened in Greece, and it happened in Cyprus. So what I'm basically saying is that it is prudent to take some assets, take it out of the financial system, and put it somewhere else as an insurance. It can be 10%, it could be 15%. In the 1980s, people used to say, take 15% of your money and put it in gold and silver and hope you never need it. We kind of forgot most of that rule. It's time to kind of go back to this because we have so much leverage, we have so much debt. And that brings me to bail-ins. The thing about bail-ins, when you have invest in something, at the end of the day, there are two ways of doing this. You're either a creditor or you're an owner. If you're a creditor, a bank deposit, money funds, and so on, as soon as you put money into a bank, it's no longer your money, strictly speaking. It's now a credit, which the bank is owing you. That money is going to be used for other purposes, and only a tiny percentage of that money, typically say 10%, is being left in the bank to allow for withdrawals and so on. So that's a risk that has to be addressed. You have probably heard of Deutsche Bank having some problems. That's another potential systemic problem. So if one bank goes down, many others will. And what's going to happen then? Well, the other option is you go into real assets. A lot of you people are in real estate, I understand. That's a real asset. You own it directly. Physical gold and silver. If it's physical and you buy it through an invoice, it's an asset. It could also be an IOU, so you really have to look into the details of these things. I made it my mission to make sure this bullion is owned by customer, not a credit. It's genuine and is stored in a safe manner in a safe jurisdiction. That's basically what we do. Or you can own cash. Now, owning cash in a bank account is different from owning physical cash. Physical cash means you have no counterparty risk. Putting a bank account, you have counterparty risk, but you cannot hold a lot of cash. Nowadays, if you own $5 million in cash, they'll probably label you a terrorist or a drug dealer or something like this. It's a real problem. You can't hold a lot of cash anymore. So, which means you end up being stuck in the financial system. The reason why I'm saying bail-ins are more and more likely is there was a Brisbane G20 conference where a lot of discussions about a template for bail-ins, and there's a financial stability board which was created. And if you look at some of the language, also documents, there's a clear statement saying bank losses should be absorbed by unsecured and uninsured creditors. Governments probably cannot afford another bailout like 2008. This time around is probably the depositors themselves which might have to pony up the money. So if anything else, what I hope is that you look at these things a little bit more from a counterparty risk point of view, because it's a real risk. In Cyprus, when the bail-in happened, accounts over $100,000 basically had a 48% haircut. So if you had $500,000, they will take almost $200,000, which will be removed. And if you lost at least 3 million euros, you qualify for a free citizenship in Cyprus. So that's Cyprus. When it comes to holding cash versus gold, there's always an argument saying, well, gold doesn't pay interest. It's true. But at the same time, cash keeps on losing value. So I created the slide to kind of point out that according to US governmental statistics, the US dollar lost over 96% of its value since 1913. Now I'm using 1913 because that was when the Federal Reserve was put into place to safeguard the value of the US dollar, among other things. And that loss is equivalent to 3.2% per year. So if you do have a cash investment, you need to generate around 3.2% per year on a 100-year sort of time frame in order not to lose purchasing power. Gold, depending on what time you take, so I'm taking $1,250, which is close to the current price, it on average gained 4.2% per year. because back in 1913 it was 1892. So short term it might lose, sure, you might gain, but over the long term, gold maintains that purchasing power. And it doesn't pay interest, but over the long term it doesn't lose value the way cash loses value. As a matter of fact, on average it would gain around 1% per year in real terms. Why is it doing that? Well, this is the amount of currencies that has been created, the monetary base. You can see with the financial crisis in 2008, it went up 450%. The amount of gold that was mined in that period, just the amount of mining, it doesn't include the utilization of gold. So the real amount might be a bit slower, but it's only around 13%. So it's only natural for gold over time to appreciate compared to cash. And then if you look at some extreme cases, me being German, in 1923 we had hyperinflation. Hyperinflation, which most people don't realize, is not really caused as much by too much money being printed. That's a precondition. It's really when people don't trust the currency anymore, and when they start expecting prices to go up, and when they start buying things, knowing the price is going to go up, that's when hyperinflation happens. They call it velocity of money, so to speak. People don't trust the currency anymore, so they start spending money right away. During 1923, people were paid twice a day. They get raises twice per day. In the morning, they would get the cash. People would run to the factory windows and throw the money at the wives. The wives would go and buy anything with it because by night, the price would have doubled. That's how extreme it ended up. Not saying this is going to happen in the US, but gold was the best protection against these sort of things. Now, real estate was also good because if you got a real estate purchase and you got a loan in what were called Papiermarks or Reichsmark, if you can see this chart, by 1918, one Reichsmark, the ratio to gold was 125. By 5th of November, it was 115 trillion or so. So basically, if you took any loan in Reichsmark, by that time it was worthless. It was terrible for people who were lending money and for savers, bank depositors and so on. It was great for borrowers. And this list here, this was an official list by the German government after they rebacked the currency with gold on how to convert old debts into gold. So this is not just a list, this was an official list. And here we can see on a logarithmic scale how quickly the currency lost value. A beer which cost 1 D-mark back in 1920, by 1923 it was something like 15 billion or so. Again, gold as an insurance. It protects purchasing power. It protects you against events like hyperinflation and so on. But then when things get really tough, governments tend to change the rules. If you look back in the United States, you might be familiar with Executive Order 6102. It was signed by Roosevelt, and it basically said that if you are on gold, then you would have to deliver it by May 1st, 1933. This was launched on April 5th, so we had around 25 days to deliver whatever gold you were in possession of to the United States Treasury. If you didn't do it, you'd be fined up to $10,000, which was a lot back in 1933, and up to 10 years in prison. Why did the government do it? Well, back then the US dollar was still backed by gold. The US was in a depression. The US needed to print more currency, create more money in order to fund the Hoover Dam and public projects and so on. But gold was basically preventing more money to be created. So by making it illegal for people to own gold, they couldn't convert their currency into gold, and that would kind of solve the problem. Once after May 1st, they devalued gold by 40%, and they basically ended up printing cash and using that to build the Hoover Dam and so on. So we have a precedent. Now, this applied not just to US citizens, this applied to any gold in the US. There were cases of Swiss citizens which had gold in safe deposit boxes in New York. Some of them had, there was one case where they had 20,000 gold coins. They were basically confiscated, and they had to pay a lot of penalties for having this. Didn't matter if you had a US citizenship or Swiss or whatever. So if you want to store some gold and you're putting in a jurisdiction which might have some incentives of doing this, you might end up with a situation like that. Now, Executive Order 6814, most people don't know about this, but similar things happened to silver. Now, US dollars were minted in silver, so it's a bit of a hybrid thing. You just couldn't own silver bars, and you had to turn these in. Australia passed a similar sort of law back in 1959. It's still on the books. It was just suspended. And Great Britain had a ban from 66 to 79 when they had financial difficulties. So governments do this when they're stout about the currency. And if in the future we have a currency crisis, if people, for whatever reason, start losing trust in the US dollar, for example, then these things become very, very relevant. So where do you store your gold? These are the traditional places where gold gets stored. New York is a huge place. Most foreign countries store gold in New York because it was deemed to be a safe place. Now, Germany, you might be aware, a few years ago, they wanted to repatriate a large amount of gold that was held at the New York Fed. And they were told it takes 7 years. Why does it take 7 years to get the gold back to Germany? Well, what's happening in this industry is if somebody stores gold for you, it's very lucrative to take that gold and lease it out to somebody else. Typically what happens is that gold gets leased out to, say, a gold miner. The gold miner sells it, uses these proceeds for infrastructure, whatever he needs to do, and promises to pay that back after a certain period of time, say 10 years. After all, it's a gold mine, he should have the gold, right? The problem with that is the gold was essentially sold and can no longer be taken possession of by the original owner. Did that happen in New York? Most likely. Why would it take 7 years to take it out? It wasn't confirmed, but that's the sort of thing that happens in the industry. So there's a lot of funny things happening in this industry because people are saying, let's be more efficient, let's find some use for this metal. But it's something which essentially is, I would consider it close to theft. Gold, it's being used as inventory, basically. When you hear fully allocated, the bullion oftentimes is really a liability. It's not something that you own directly. So what we do is whatever bullion comes in is basically stored on a segregated basis on your name under Singapore law. But anyway, so where to store bullion? Most of our customers don't want to store it in New York or London because of some of the reasons I've given previously. Switzerland has been very popular in the past. Right now, if you go to Switzerland, it's very difficult for American citizens to open any kind of account. They're scared from FATCA and these sort of things. So Hong Kong is essentially under Chinese control. Shanghai is becoming a big gold trading hub, but that's mostly the Chinese. There's a lot of regulation on getting gold out and so on. It doesn't really make sense for a Westerner to go there. And that leaves Singapore. And I would assume that a lot of you might not heard about Singapore. So what we'll be doing next is give you a little bit of an overview why Singapore is a good jurisdiction. So when I moved to Singapore, this book I read, From Third World to First World, I said, here's a government which really seems to be working well. I didn't think something like this really existed. But you can kind of tell over here. It's ranked the second freest economy by Wall Street Journal. It's very much market-based. It's ranked as the easiest place to do business by the World Bank Group. It is listed as the sixth least corrupt country in the world, least corrupt in Asia by Transparency International. It's the most technology-ready country in the world according to the World Economic Forum. It's quite common in Singapore now to have 2 gigabyte internet connections, for example. The education system is very good. We are having, in most contests and so on, Singaporeans are sort of on top. And it's quite a tourist place as well. There are about 15 million tourists coming every year. It's been ranked the 6th best world destination by New York Times. It's a bridge between Asia and the West. English is the official language. Everybody speaks English. About 3/4 of the population is of Chinese origin. They're very different from the mainland Chinese, but they're of that sort of origin, so many of them still speak Chinese. 30% are Malays, which is, let's say, the indigenous people, and around 9% are Indians, with 4% being Europeans and other countries. So it's very diverse. There are 6 official religions, 4 official languages. It's very open. 29% of the people working there are foreigners, a lot of Europeans. Taxes are very low. And Singapore has been the model for Chinese special economic zones. Shanghai, for example, was modeled after Singapore in the 1980s. So it's a place where things just work and people trust the government. A lot of countries nowadays, the people don't trust the government anymore. This is a recent image of Singapore. I just kind of thought to put it up here to kind of show you. This is a stadium. It's the largest freeholding stadium, dome stadium in the world, apparently. They just, during National Day, had fireworks inside the stadium. This land over here is all artificial land, which was added over the last 20, 30 years. You might not be able to see it, but this waterways here used to be ocean. With Marina Barrage being up here, it's converting all that water into sweet water, as a water reservoir. Back here you have Marina Bay Sands. That's one of the most expensive buildings in the world. It's sort of this 3-tower banana-shaped hotel with a free swimming pool at 200 meters height or something like this. So it is a place where there's continual construction, continual growth. It's quite exciting to go to. They're very wealthy. Singapore had a budget surplus 23 times out of the last 25 years. Taxes are low, but from the economic process and so on, they managed to have surpluses. The retirement system and so on are all fully funded. It's basically akin to a 401k with a few differences. So everybody puts money into their own retirement fund. You have to put up to 20% of your income into it. Your employer puts 16%, which means even if you clean the street, you probably end up with $150,000 by the time you retire. You can use that money to buy a home. You can use that money to pay your mortgage. If you leave Singapore, they pay it out for you. It's truly your money. So they don't have the unfunded liability problems that most of the Western world has. It's the only country in Asia with a AAA rating by all credit agencies. So in other words, they're rich. The reason I'm saying this is if you put your gold in a country, it makes sense to put in a rich country because they will have fewer and fewer reasons to actually nationalize it. It's very diversified. It's the 3rd largest financial center in the world. It's also the 3rd largest gambling center. They only have 2 casinos, but these casinos are making huge amount of volumes. As a side note, if you're Singaporean, you have to pay $100 to go into the casino as a way of trying to prevent the locals from gambling too much. And they have a no-play list. If your wife doesn't want you to play, she can put you on the no-play list, and you don't get to get into the casino. So that's the Singaporean way. They want foreigners to gamble. It's also the 3rd largest petroleum refinery in the world. There were separate islands. You see these tanker ships coming in and unloading the unrefined fuel, and it's being refined. Another tanker comes in and picks it up. Semiconductors, 10% of semiconductor wafers are coming out of Singapore. And it's a big tourist destination. So the government has it's the 11th highest national reserves in the world. It's the highest per capita. It's $150,000 in national reserves for each citizen. So again, it's a very rich country. It's a very strong rule of law. It's a very small country, only 719 square kilometers. It used to be 530. So they made almost 200 kilometers out of land reclamation. And no natural resources. So the government always tells its people, you have to work hard because we don't have any oil. You have to study hard because there's no oil. So the government says, it's my task as a government to make sure that you have a good education. It's my task to make sure there's conditions for jobs. It's your job to work. So there's no unemployment help. But there are 10,000 multinational corporations. And what's relevant for gold storage, the whole economy is based on confidence. There's zero tolerance on corruption. And if Singapore ever to nationalize gold, that will betray that confidence. It's economic suicide. So again, that makes it very unlikely for the Singapore government to do something like this. You might have heard of Michael Fay. Michael Fay spray painted a bunch of cars in Singapore. He was sentenced to 6 strokes of the cane, which is quite painful. And it became a big thing in the US because his daddy was a diplomat. I was living in the US back then. Half the US seemed to say, this is great, we should do it in the US as well. We would have a lot less spray painting. The other half said this is barbaric. You know, why would Singapore do something like this? But the point is, President Clinton actually called the Singapore White House and told them, you know what, forget about this, send back the kid and don't cane him. And Singapore said, well, Mr. President, with all due respect, we have laws in Singapore. How are we going to explain to our citizen that just because his kid has a famous or influential dad, that the laws don't apply suddenly? So he was caned, and then he was sent back. So this might be, a little innocuous little matter, but little tiny Singapore stood up to the President of the United States saying no. That's why Singapore is a good jurisdiction for gold. And Singapore has a strong defense. I wouldn't compare it to the US or anything, but you have a 2-year draft, and you have to go back to the military until age 40, which means they can raise an army of 400,000 within a few days, which is amazing for such a small place. Military budget is more than twice that of neighboring countries like Malaysia. And they have bases all over the world, including the United States, for their airplanes. They have about 120 F-16 and F-15s, as well as supporting craft, refuelers, and so on, missile frigates, and so on and so on. So politics is like Switzerland. They never ally themselves with anybody. US warships can dock at Singapore ports, but so can Chinese and so can Russians. It's a Swiss sort of always neutral policy. So, about 4 years ago, Singapore kind of realized, always looking for a little role in the world, that it has the right conditions to become a bullion trading hub. And so they passed a bunch of laws to encourage this. They removed all taxation on gold or silver. There's no capital gain taxes in Singapore anyway. There are no duties, there are no import-export restrictions. And there's a local refinery now, which means you can easily get large amounts of gold, and liquidity is very easy. When it comes to FATCA, all of you probably know that investing abroad, just about every country now has signed FATCA agreements, so has Singapore. But the US definition of a financial institution, which is what you have to be to comply to FATCA, is anybody dealing in commodities. It's very broad, which means a grocery store might be deemed as a financial institution. It might have to report, which leaves a lot of uncertainty. Singapore did not accept that definition in the scope of the agreement between the two countries. and it was changed to anybody dealing in commodity futures. For us, that means that we do not fall under FATCA. We don't have any reporting requirement back to the US or back to Singapore for that matter. And you can give me more information about these sort of things if you like, but that's what makes precious metals interesting as well, because they're physical. Now, some of the photos you can see here, this is a 2.5 ton vault at our facility. All bullion is stored in these pallet cages. And these are big safe deposit boxes for silver. You can store 200 kilograms in there. Do we have time for a video? This is 2 minutes.
Couple questions?
What this is a 2-minute video if we have time on it. This is the facility itself.
Want to see the facility? Let's do it.
So around, you can store up to 630 tons of silver. We can put the volume down a little bit. That might be good. Okay. Security is provided by Singapore Auxiliary Police, which also ensures that when a seal is broken or something, it's an independent party verifying these sort of things. When bullion is being stored, it can be put in a safe deposit box. This type of box here can store about 500 ounces of gold, which is around 600,000 US dollars, and it goes into a class 2 vault, which means it's fully insured. This is a silver box, which can put around 6,500 ounces, around 200 kilograms of silver. With a 2.5 ton door, and this goes into the silver vault. You can see the silver back here, so inside what we call pallet cages. It's very neatly arranged. Inside the pallet cages, we have the actual parcels. Each one is individually owned by different customers. These are safe deposit boxes being stored. We bring the safe deposit box to the customer. So this is a class 2 vault where the gold is stored. It's basically a vault within a vault. And these safe deposit boxes here is where the gold itself goes. We test all of the bullion using X-ray spectrography, using ultrasound and electroconductivity testing. The bullion then gets packaged into parcels like this, and the parcels go into the big pallet cages. The pallet cages then get slotted in. We keep track of each individual parcel, wherever it goes. This is being audited by PricewaterhouseCoopers and by Bureau Veritas 4 times per year. It all goes into a parcel, into a big list, and you can verify that your name is associated with that parcel, making it possible for us to double assign these parcels. And if your bullion does not come directly from the mint, there's a test certificate on who did the test and what the results were. Information of the safe house is all kept offline. It's an ISO certified facility. And we are now storing or renting out some capacity to Loomis, which is one of the biggest vault providers in the world, which are storing bullion for most banks out there. So that's the facility. Questions?
Any quick ones? The only question I'd have is on the physical logistics of transportation. Do most people get it there, or are people bringing it from here? What do you see as most common?
We've had quite a number of customers transferring from providers like Gold Money, Bullion Vaults, and other facilities over to us. We had private people. Sometimes people store gold in a facility, but it's stored on a set to contain basis, meaning nobody will really know whether it's real gold or not. And so it's difficult to sell or buy. If they transfer it to us, we actually go through the testing process. If you want to sell it to us, then we can just buy it directly. So we create liquidity some way. But yeah, we have transfer in. About half of our customers are US-based. The rest are Australian, Europeans, Indonesians. Not so many Singaporeans, because in many ways I'm selling Singapore as a jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. That's difficult to do as a Singaporean. Yeah.
Oh, real easy.
Yep,
one quick
please.
one. 30-second answer.
You mentioned enough about the purchasing power of gold, but you didn't talk much about the purchasing power of silver. How has silver performed? When I talked about silver, I can talk about hours for why silver is a good buy.
Maybe the quickest answer will be there's a gold and silver ratio, which is how many ounces of silver does it take to buy 1 ounce of gold. And over time, this varies between 40 and 80. Right now, we're around 72, 73. Basically means silver is very cheap compared to gold. So silver is a good buy. Plus, silver is the forgotten metal. People never talk about. In the US, people actually do talk about silver, but outside of the US, people normally just talk about gold, not so much silver. So that's why we have a big sort of predilection towards silver. And we build our vault with silver in mind first, which is why we have these big cages and have the ability of storing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.